The session is a panel with two authors. Both of them have written recent books on disability. So the panel is titled The Disability Story. And of course, those of you who have the schedule will notice that the word disability is in quotes. So this panel next is The Disability Story, and joining us is our Srilata, K. Srilata, and Someshwar Sati, and moderating this session is Sridala, Swami. Of course, the bios of the speakers are in the tabloid that you have, and maybe Sridala will also introduce them very briefly, but just a line about Sridala. And Sridala is going to get the second best bio, the most editor-friendly bio for 2023 HLF, because she sent us one-line bio, which is extremely reader-friendly, which is extremely editor-friendly, because very often, rarely does one get the chance to expand a bio. Very often one has to struggle to make it shorter to fit into 100 words, but Sridala sent a one-line bio, and that's what I'm going to say. Sridala is a poet, and we have her poetry reading session later on today.
I'm Sridala. Next to me is K. Srilata, and at the far end is Professor Someshwar Sati. K. Srilata is a poet, fiction writer, translator, and academic. We are here today to discuss, amongst other things, her book, This Kind of Child. And Professor Someshwar Sati is a professor at the Department of English at Kirodimal College. He is the coordinator of the Center of Disability Research and Training and the chairperson of the Indian Disability Studies Collective. His latest publications include Reclaiming the Disabled Subject, Representing Disability in Short Fiction, the volume 1 of which was published in 2022, and Disability in Translation, The Indian Experience. Welcome to this session, Srilata and Someshwar. I want to begin by noting that amongst all of us in this audience, and personally, and the way we live in the world, although the world is geared towards the able-bodied person, it's unlikely that we, especially in the post-pandemic world, have no experience of disability, either personally or amongst the people in our family. So I would like to begin by asking both of you, we'll begin with you, Professor Someshwar, what you understand by disability.
Well, the word disability in common parlance is generally used to denote a clinically diagnosed physical or mental deficit that hinders and at times even incapacitates the individual from performing normative life function. What we generally find is a tendency to associate disability with some kind of lack by medicalizing the phenomena and trace the genesis of disability to the human body. But the real question that I would like to pose is that, is disability necessarily exclusively related to the human body? Take, for example, a wheelchair user who is confronted with a flight of steps. When confronted with a flight of steps, the wheelchair user is, if we may say, rendered disabled, unable to go up or down the staircase. But the moment you provide that very same wheelchair user with a ramp or an elevator, he or she ceases to be disabled. If this is the case, can we say that disability is exclusively associated with the human body? Or does it have something to do with a hostile social environment that pays scant attention to the needs of the disabled person? In fact, I feel that, by medicalizing the phenomena, we are, in fact, trying to exonerate society from any form of culpability in the shaping of the experience of disability. We are also at the same time trying to naturalize the phenomena. And I would invite you to think about a few things right now. For example, behavior like obsessive-compulsive behavior, like washing one's hands, for example. Pre-COVID, that particular kind of behavior was taken to be a symptom of mental instability. But during the days of COVID, that so-called deviant behavior becomes the norm. If a particular behavior can become normative and normal at a point of time and then suddenly become deviant, then is disability actually normal? So I very strongly feel that disability has less to do with the human body and more to do with a set of cultural norms about what bodies can and cannot do, and what bodies should behave in what manners. Therefore, I would agree with Leonard Davis that the problem is not the persons with disability. The real problem is the way that the idea of the normal has been constructed to create the problem of the disabled person. And our task should really be to try to work out alternative ways of thinking about corporeal difference. And in the collection of short stories that we have edited, that is precisely the task that we are engaged with. I'm sure that even Srilata's work deals necessarily with the idea of looking at disability from a different perspective.
Yeah, Srilata, would you like to introduce your book at the same time as you respond to?
Yeah, thank you, Sridala, and thank you, Professor Someshwar. The book that I worked on over the course of, I think, the last 3 or 4 years, titled This Kind of Child, really started out as a personal account of what it means to be the parent of a child with an invisible disability. So my daughter was diagnosed with dyslexia, and she had struggles right through her school years. And this was something, I think, for a long time I didn't think of it really as something that the school or the environment was causing. Right, as Professor Someshwar put it, very often it is not in the body or in the mind, but the disability angle comes in because there are barriers. These could be, the lack of a ramp or a staircase that suddenly shows up when you're a wheelchair user. You don't know how to then navigate the physical terrain. And when you have an invisible disability, say dyslexia or even a mental illness, right, what you don't, it's kind of actually even harder because people around you don't know, or they look at you and say, you look fine. You're probably just lazy, or you will get over this and things will be fine. So the barrier is not obvious to anyone except for the person who is living the barrier, right? And in this case, I think in my daughter's case and in the case of many others that we know with invisible disabilities, the barrier is attitudinal. It is caused by environments such as school, social environments, society disabilities, expectations in terms of timeline, what should a child learn to do by what age, what should their behavior be like, what kinds of marks should they score, all of that. I think it's a familiar story for all of us parents, right? So that is how the book started. But very soon it sort of organically grew into being, so what it now is really a multi-genre book with personal accounts that I invited from persons with other sorts of disabilities, right? So people with cerebral palsy, people with autism, their parents, the entire ecosystem that surrounds the disability experience, right? So if you have a child or a young person with any sort of a disability, right? I think what happens is that there is a certain the experience is not just confined to that person alone. It's the entire family, the society around them. Society actually loses. We don't understand that, right? There is actually a loss to, I think, I don't like to use the word productivity, but yes, it is a loss to, we just lose people. We lose their work. We lose minds. We sort of lose because we don't understand how to help them, how to sort of support them in their needs, and in a sensible, rational, reasonable sort of way. We just don't do that. Right? So there is an ecosystem of people who look after or offer care to people with disabilities. There are parents, there are special educators, there are siblings, there are children of people with disabilities. So the experience spills over and also becomes their experience in a sense, right? So this is what the book is really trying to do, to give you a slice of what does that planet mean? I mean, the planet of people with disabilities. And you also learn, or I learned certainly, right, that it is not, disability is not something that is perhaps, just going to happen to some people. Some people are born with mobility issue and they have to be in a wheelchair, so they are disabled. We are not. No, it doesn't work like that. Take each and every one of us in this audience. We are all going to face some disability in the course of our lives, right? So we are really, in that sense, one collective human race. And I think it's therefore important to not marginalize it and say, okay, this is an issue that concerns only so-and-so or only so-and-so. This is a question that's going to happen to all of us. It's something that's going to happen to all of us.
Professor Someshwar mentioned Leonard Davis, and you have also cited Leonard Davis in your work, which is a very wide-ranging, like you said, from several perspectives, because a person with disability is a kind of a stone in a pond sending ripples out, and everyone is affected and needs to somehow come to figure out how they are going to include everyone into the world. So both your work comes from hard-won experience, personal experience, and you have mentioned all kinds of work in the course of your book, and Someshwar, at the end of your introduction, and actually at the end of the introduction to every story in the volume, there is a list of books that went into that you consulted and the works that you cite. Now, the kind of books that you read that help you understand and theorize your experience, that's one part of it. What are the readings that you did that helped you understand your world and what you were experiencing better? But at the same time, while reading your book, Srilata, I realized that there are so many people who do not have the access to that kind of reading. You don't have help in somebody else's words helping you understand. And I was wondering, Someshwar, if the stories that you included in the anthology are a way for people to access an understanding of their situation through the experiences of others. It's a slightly complicated but related set of questions, the reading that you did and the reading that might help others via stories when a more theoretical reading is not accessible to them.
Let me answer your second question first. Yes, you are absolutely right when you say that I use the stories to illustrate the experience of disablement. For example, when we have a story like Shubha, the general understanding is that a speech impairment is the product of an inability to speak. But writing in the last decade of the 19th century, way back then, Rabindranath Tagore acquaints us with a different dimension of disability. He shows how a speech-impaired young girl is very expressive. She expresses through her eyes, through her feelings, emotions. She can communicate with animals and the natural world. But what about the human society? They do not even pay attention to the fact that she is expressing something. They prefer not to listen to her because she is not speaking in the kind of normative idiom of verbal expression. And therefore, the sense that even disabled people, when they go through their experiences, tend to feel the same. That, look, I'm disabled not because I'm not able to do this in the particular normative way, but I'm disabled because the society at large is not willing to accommodate my mode of doing that particular thing, right? So disability is the inability to see ability. That is something that we always say. And disabled people who, as you rightly said, have no access to theoretical work or theoretical reading, have their own ideas about disability. And the stories communicate to these people very directly. Now, coming to the question of the theories that I have used in between, the theories are meant to illuminate the experience of disability and give it a deeper and more nuanced understanding. How should the general public read these theories? Why did I use it? The real reason for using the stories is for the larger public to communicate directly to it. And the theorization happens because I strongly feel that disability is not erased from cultural representation. Our tradition is replete with representations of disability, from the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, downwards. But within our classroom, there is no attempt to engage with it as a subject of academic inquiry. My intention of introducing theoretical stuff was largely to show the Indian academia at large that, look, even disability can be studied as an academic subject. And there is plenty of critical traditions on it. The fact that most of us are not aware of it does not mean that it doesn't exist. So that is the main reason that I have brought in theoretical perspective, so that people may realize that research in this area, even if one wants to do theoretically nuanced research, is very much possible.
Srilata?
I think, there is a way in which this understanding of disability or a perspective on it should be part of all the realms of living, really, right? It definitely should be part of our classroom experience, as Professor Someshwar says, and I think it will greatly enrich our curriculum, it will greatly enrich the minds of our students, and so on. And I think there's a very important place for theory, for actually looking at it, figuring out what is the lens through which you understand this human experience, right? So there's a way in which I think that's hugely important. But equally, I think there is an argument for ensuring that this understanding of what the experience is all about, what the disability story is all about, is not just I don't want to say just an academic exercise, but an academic exercise alone, and that it should really be part of the fabric of our everyday life in some ways, right? And that's not it's easier said than done, obviously. And to kind of answer your question, Sridala, you're very right, because in the course of some of the interviews that I did with parents from very disadvantaged backgrounds, parents of children with very profound difficulties, disabilities, challenges, and so on. One of the things that occurred to me as I was speaking to, for instance, Wahida, who is the mother of a young woman with an intellectual impairment. And, her husband actually sort of really disowned the family, and she talks about that. One of the things that went through my mind is, where is Wahida going to turn to for strength? She's not going to be able to access, forget academic inquiry, she's not going to be even able to access this book because it's all in English. And the interview was done in Tamil, the conversations were in Tamil, and I had to sort of translate and transcribe and translate and all of that, right? But I think for somebody like Wahida, right, this conversation should reach someone like Wahida. This conversation should somehow be part of her daughter's life or her everyday life. And that's my hope, really, right? And I think, yes, it should be part of our classroom. It should be part of every, the ways in which we think about the building of our schools, the building of, the creation of all sorts of things. I mean, even venues such as HLF, the venue for HLF, right? If you look at it through the perspective of accessibility, what happens, right? Who is able to be part of this event, for instance? I think it's important to ask this question in every context that we take ourselves to. And it should be part of a general conversation. It does not end with the book. It does not end with any of our discussions. No, I don't think so.
Yeah, the way both of you spoke about the invisibility of disability, it occurred to me that there are so many similarities between your book, because in your introduction, Someshwar, you begin by talking about how you ask a student for a PhD student for her suggestions, for their suggestions for stories in which there are characters or that speak about disability. And this person said, I can't think of any stories. And they said, really? And then they mentioned Tagore's story, and then they mentioned a couple of other stories. And then this person said, oh, yes. And then started offering suggestions for the kind of stories with characters with disability. So even though you have read and encountered stories, this whole experience becomes invisible to you because it is not your personal experience. And in the same way, Srilata, when you were talking in your own essay, which is a kind of a mirror to your daughter's essay about yourselves, you talk about meeting this principle, and I wrote this down because it was something to me. You said something very interesting. You said the system remained blind to her struggles. Okay, about what the principal said. And I was struck by your use of the figurative use of blind in this context. And it occurs to me that, the society at large or institutions, their inability is often a disability, and it is, so I'd like both of you all to respond to this question of invisibility in terms of disability.
Yes, Sridala, the story with which I open my introduction is an actual encounter with a research scholar. I seized upon the opportunity to ask her whether she could help me with identifying some short stories on disability in Bangla. And she said that, well, no such stories of the kind exist in the language. I was very surprised. So I asked her, what about Tagore's Shubha? She said, and she started laughing. Yes, Tagore's Shubha. And then, there is also Drishtidan. the blind Kumu. And then she listed out a number of short stories in Bangla which had disabled characters. So this really raised a question inside me that why isn't she able to recognize a disability text even when she encounters one? And the answer to this question is very complex because she has not been trained to do so. And it's largely because most disability stories are stories about individuals. It's a Shubha, it's a Kumu, it is whatever, it's an individual. So people tend to encounter disability as an individual problem. And that in itself is a problem. Disability is not just a problem of the individual. Disability is a systemic problem. But because stories are narrated through the story of particular individuals and the collectivity is not engaged with, we fail to see it as a systemic problem. So Shubha's story is Shubha's story. It's not a story about speech impairment at all. And that is very frightening, that we acknowledge the phenomena at an individual level, but we refuse it to understand it as a systemic problem that needs collective effort to address. And this is a very serious problem. I just want to add another anecdote that led to the writing of these volumes. When we first said that we wanted to organize a seminar on short stories around disability, even our so-called liberal colleagues who are never tired of flagging post-colonial, feminist and Dalit questions looked at us with puzzled eyes, as if they were even questioning the state of our sanity, And, their looks seem to suggest that what is the point? Do we have enough texts in the language to merit a whole seminar? So, what is the point indeed when most of us are temporarily abled bodies, are potentially disabled citizens of tomorrow, and yet, what is the point? We have a tradition of 3,000 years old of disability representation, and yet, what is the point? We have a population of over 20 million disabled people in India, and yet, what is the point? Dear friends, this is a systemic problem that needs to be addressed at a systemic level. It is not just an individual encounter with a medical condition.
Yeah, thank you for that, Professor Someshwar. I completely agree with everything that you said just now. I think, in fact, the whole disability question is more marginal than any of the other more marginal questions in academia. I completely agree. I think there's always an audience to be had for a post-colonial conference or a conference on feminism. But I think if you raise the question of disability, people are going to look at you as, okay, it's an individual story, so, what's the big deal, right? And that needs to change, I think, because, as he says, there's a large population of us, and it's also, we're all in temporarily able bodies, perhaps, and who knows, right? So I think it's always good to keep that in mind. But to answer your question also, Sridala, I think I agree that the lack is not, the lack within quotes, is not with the person with the disability, but there is a lack of understanding, and I think that is the lack or the shortfall or the disability that we must be paying attention to, right? Because if you don't understand this very profound area of human experience, we must ask the question, who is the person with a disability here? right? And I think, and not to sort of blame them or sort of pass judgments on, look, this person doesn't even understand what all this is about. Because again, all of us are products of the same very narrow school systems and university systems and social systems, right? So nobody teaches you, nobody takes you aside and says, look, here's how you need to think about this, right? And I think it's therefore important to have, I think, academic inquiries and research such as what Professor Someshwar was just talking about, and all sorts of other initiatives across society to make that conversation happen and to say, look, it's not, a small set of people who have a lack, or, we can just forget about them for now and get on with it, right? But to say, look, it's going to happen to all of us, and we need to understand this better and navigate this better.
Yeah.
I absolutely agree with you, and I want to carry your argument further by laying emphasis on a misunderstanding that revolves around the word disability. When we use the term disability, we are not referring to the individual. We are referring to the disabling environment. Let me just explain this with a quick example. For example, if there is a bomb and the army squad is called in, and the army squad disabled the bomb. So we will say that the bomb was disabled, right? So who is the agent of the disabling? Does disability refer to the bomb, or does it refer to the action of the army? Obviously, the reference of disability is to society at large, and society disables the individual. So we should not be afraid of calling people disabled, because the reference is not to the individual, the reference is to the social environment. And hence, I think we should have a very clear understanding that disability is not associated with the individual, but with the environment. And I think for those who would like to understand this further, they should definitely read H.G. Wells' The Country of the Blind. Because this gentleman is caught in an environment which is completely scripted for the blind. There you are made to work in the night. This person, sighted person, is not able to work there in the light. He finds himself short of the productivity, as it's so-called, compared to the blind people. So it depends on the environment that you hand out to people that disability is defined. For example, if we start speaking here in sign language and most of the audience doesn't understand, would we call the audience disabled? Or would we say that we are speaking in a language that the audience does not understand? So where is the culpability? I think this is a very important issue that we need to understand in social terms rather than individual terms.
Yeah, of course, Srilata. Yeah, please.
Just a quick intervention in response to what Professor Someshwar just said. I think one of the questions that came up repeatedly when this book came out from friends and from a number of very sort of interested readers and others was that, by sort of labeling people, and sort of outing them in a sense. I think that was the question, right? Outing them as disabled somehow. Isn't it a kind of disservice to people in the book, because everyone's going to look at them and say, oh, they are the people with the disability, right? Beginning with my own daughter. And I found that very curious, and I don't want to judge that because I think I see where that's coming from. But I think that question, sort of haunts me even now. And, so it's really that there is a tendency, I think, in our society, far from engaging with the question and saying, look, it's going to happen to all of us. It's happening to people in our families, any one of us, right? There isn't a single family here, I'm sure, where there isn't a person with some sort of a disability, right? Acknowledge it or not, that's another issue. But given that, right, if you don't sort of engage with it, but in fact, on the other hand, you sort of try to sweep it under the carpet, make it invisible, make it sort of almost hope that it will kind of go away. And it's worse when it's an invisible disability. Because then, it's actually people think it's very easy to sort of hide it. Why even say it? Why even talk about it? Right? Why all that? But I just wanted to sort of bring this out here in response to what.
Just as brief comments. There are certain things that you know very well from feminism, feminist discourse in recent times. For instance, you will say, my feminism will be intersectional or it will be bullshit. And you have to apply that to other things as well, including disability, I've forgotten what the other thing was, but there was another one. If it comes back to me, I will say it. But I just want to ask, I'll just say one more thing, ask one thing of each of you, and then we'll open it out to questions. Someshwar, you wanted to discuss translation as it relates to disability. So I'd like you to briefly talk about that. And afterwards, Srilata, if you can read an excerpt from your book.
Yes, the question of translation is very important because most of the stories, or in fact all of the stories that I have in the collection, are translated from different Indian languages, 12 of them in fact. Now, for example, in the Bangla original, Shubha, her speech impairment is referred to as Boba. Boba is a very value-neutral term which only indicates the inability to speak. But earlier translations of Shubha, you will find that Boba is translated as dumb. Now the word dumb has multiple connotations, and that is, it has something to do with your inability to think as well. So, the insensitivity of the choice of language establishes connections that are not really grounded in reality. And that is a great problem. And that it also shows the role that language plays in shaping our understanding of things. But nowadays, fortunately, more recent translations of Shubha prefer the word mute over dumb. Not only that, in the volume that we have come out with, we have changed the ending a bit. Changed the ending in the sense of the phrasing of it. For example, the original ends with something like she's married off to a husband without being told. The husband is not told that she is unable to speak. So when he discovers it, he marries again, right? So Shubha is rendered eminently disposable. But the way it's said in earlier translation is that he married again, this time a woman who could speak. And we worked on the translation and we changed the translation in a different way. We posed it as he married again, he married a woman who could speak a language he could understand. And that small change made a world of, changed the significance of the story in its entirety, right? So a translation is a very important tool through which we can intervene in normative representations and change the significance of the story altogether without actually changing the plot of the story. So yes, translation is very important, and it draws attention to the role of language in shaping our understanding of disabilities.
Yeah, That's very true. Thank you. Srilata, will you read an excerpt? And then we'll open it out to questions.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Sridala. So I'll read this very short excerpt from a piece I have in the book. It's also called This Kind of Child, and it's about sort of my own experience of being a parent, right? I distinctly remember that bleak November day in 2013, the skies grey and grieving, just as I was for my daughter, whom we had pulled out of school a couple of months ago. There she lay huddled under a light quilt, unmindful of the blare of school bus horns, seemingly oblivious to the life that was passing her by. I grieved because I was convinced that she would never find her way back into the maze that counted as education. It seemed to me that she was lost, and hopelessly so. If the liberal Montessori school to which we had admitted her could fail her so badly, what chance did she have in any other? And by extension, what chance really did she have in this difficult world? She had joined India's millions of left-behind children, and it didn't seem to me at the time that she would ever catch up with the rest. Dyslexia, or whatever it was that passed for it, had failed her. It had tripped her up. As I sat at her bedside that morning, it occurred to me that my daughter had no place to turn to, that the four of us, her father, her brother, her grandmother and I, would somehow have to become that place. Home was the only school that would take her. My daughter was 9 when we took her out of school. I couldn't help thinking of her first day at school. She had gone in with sparkling eyes and feet that danced to music that only she could hear. My husband's aunt remarked once that she was like a small butterfly with her light and happy movements. All through those early school years, I had read to her and to my son stories and poems at bedtime and whenever the opportunity presented itself. My son became an independent reader at some point. This transition had been so smooth, so organic that I had barely noticed. As for my daughter, she clearly enjoyed listening to the stories I read her and knew them all by heart. She had a great sense of the spoken word, often spoke in metaphors herself, and had sound literary judgment, except that reading and writing did not come to her easily. By the time she turned 7, I was quite certain that something was amiss, that there was a reason why she wasn't getting around to reading, even though she was obviously bright and curious, open to new ideas, and was possessed of a burning desire to learn. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll open it out to questions as I see people. Anju over there at the back. No, just please wait. We will pass the mic along one after the other. Please sit.
Good afternoon. I would like to make one point, and this was very, very important. I don't think they like being called mute. They are very, very proud people who cannot speak and cannot hear, choose. I emphasize choose to belong to a group of deaf community written with capital D. So they write Anju Deaf Khemani. You're right, sir. Dumb is not something they like to use, and we should not. You're absolutely right. But neither mute is another thing that they don't like. Unless there are some people who are hearing impaired and speech impaired, they may not be called deaf because they may choose not to belong to the deaf community. Deaf community is very proud of their language, and any community that has language has culture. And many translations don't work because when I sit with them and work with some stories, they do get back to me and say, what kind of a story is that? And as a result, there are many scripts we reject because while they understand the story, their culture does not even understand. So some translations are truly lost on them. I'm actually sitting here with an author, Dr. Urvi Jangam, who's born blind. And she would agree with you that I don't know about disability, we use the word handicapped is not the person's problem, it's the environment that handicaps us. So you are handicapped, but disability maybe. Urvi, is there anything you'd like to say?
That was a very succinct observation. In fact, I think most of us are aware of the fact that the deaf community do not want to call themselves disabled. In America, they are fighting for rights of linguistic minority, right? So they see themselves as a linguistic minority rather than a disabled. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. You're absolutely right. They're fighting for it here also, and only now the national education policy has accepted it as a language. The government still has to.
Yeah, thanks, Sanju. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a different language. It's altogether. And coming to the word handicapped, and there is a lot of sensitivity associated with the kind of phrases that we use. We rampantly use words like differently abled. Is that a correct connotation? Can any one of you name two people who are exactly the same in terms of ability? Or two people who are not differently abled from each other? The whole idea is to create an inclusive society. Then why are you referring to a community as different? Or for that matter, special? So we should not use terms like differently abled or especially abled either. The preferred term among scholars in disability studies is the term called, which goes as persons with disabilities, which foregrounds personhood over disability. But you have political and social activists who prefer the term disabled people or a disabled person because they want to foreground their identity as disabled so that they can unite and fight for a common cause. So please, let us just use two terms, persons with disability, PWDs, or disabled person, and reject all other forms of expression which can create a great problem and misunderstanding among the community, especially if it emphasizes on difference.
Thank you. Yes, please, you will have your turn. Thank you.
My turn. I'm Dr. Sudhir Bhan. I'm a speech pathologist and a special educator.
I can't hear you.
I'm a Dr. Sudhir Bhan, special educator and speech pathologist. So I outrightly reject these terms, disabled and this thing. Better term is to use people with difficulty, learning difficulty. That is a better term. So that is one thing, and we also have laws for the disabled people under which their rights can be protected. NEP is a new thing. There is not much in NEP, but already there are laws for children who are autistic children, hearing impaired, dyslexics. We have clear laws there. Now I have a question regarding this child. Is the child only hearing impaired or also have dyslexia?
Who is the question addressed to, please?
To me.
To Srilata. Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, so she was actually diagnosed with dyslexia. She does not have a hearing impairment. Yeah.
Hearing impairment is not there. Then it's not a cause of concern.
Sorry, I didn't get that.
It's not a cause of concern then.
No, I'm not. I think it should be a cause of concern for everybody here because there are so many children with an invisible disability like that or a disability. But it is not addressed.
Early intervention may help. I will give her.
No. I take your point.
Yeah,
so we did do that, but I don't think there is enough by way of societal support. So I think that book is making a bit difference.
There is stigma attached, but once awareness is there, people may learn to do it.
Yeah,
we have
thank you.
autistic children who have much more problems.
Thank you. Is there anyone else? Yes, over here.
I would quickly like to add to what Srilata was saying and to his question. He mentioned that there are a number of laws. The laws are framed by the government, but are these laws implemented? The government frames laws, and in the case of disability, do you know who is which institution infringes most of the laws? It is the government. So framing of laws is not important. We need to implement them and change the mindset of the society at large. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, next question.
I have a slightly different question. So, is there any literature which approaches these topics in a more humorous kind of manner? Otherwise, most literature or media tends to take a maudlin, sentimental kind of approach to these things, which actually tends to dehumanize some of them, right? But actually, if you take a more lighter way in humorous approach, actually they feel more integrated in, people reading that actually can feel more engaged with those characters. So is there literature which actually deals in this manner, kind of manner?
Thank you. Yeah. Could I take that, Someshwar?
Well, I didn't understand what he asked, so would you please rephrase it just very quickly?
No, I think his question was, is there literature that, that sort of takes a more humorous approach to this whole issue? So it's not always sort of a maudlin, sort of an unhappy reading experience and things like that. So I'll just quickly respond to that question, if I may. Yeah. Well, I mean, this is, I think, just to go back to Someshwar's own thing about the way, cultural representation is done, I think for centuries, in fact, people with disabilities have been sort of made fun of. So humor is there, but what kind of a humor? So it becomes really questionable, right? And I'm sure you're not talking about that. I get that that's not the place you're coming from. But I think, this is just the way I respond. I mean, I think there's a way in which there is, I think there's no pussyfooting around this experience and saying, you just take a humorous approach to it and all will be well, because very often all is not well. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but it is really a hard thing. And it's a hard world. I mean, the world has made it hard, as Someshwar has said over and over again, And I think, yes, persons with disabilities have a deadly sense of humor. So it's not as though they're just sitting around and moaning and groaning all the time. It's not there. But I am not, and I think there's a way in which we should all be able to get to that point where we have happy narratives and narratives that use a sense of humor. But I think we won't get to that place unless we get through this, So that's just my response. I don't think.
Yes, adding to what Srilata just said, I think it's very important to normalize the various forms of disability and to treat it as a norm. Whether it is humorous, because when we talk in terms of humor, the humor that is used in literature by and large, as Srilata pointed out, is one that tries to set up the identity of the non-disabled as being superior to that of the disabled. And that kind of humor is what is rampant. And that is definitely not desirable. But if by just making the ending happy, is that recourse to it? Most happy endings in narrative of disability is that the disability has been cured. But is that the real desirable kind of happy ending that we should be talking about? When we talk about cure as the only solution of negotiating disability, aren't we pushing disability back to a kind of position where it is an undesirable state of being altogether, subhuman and perhaps totally avoidable? I don't think that is the direction that we should be moving on.
Yeah. We'll take one last question before we close this session.
Hi, I just have a question. I just want to say it's so special to me right now because I was a student of Professor Srilata's and I'm also a student of Vidyaranya's, so this is a really special experience. In my work, I encounter a lot of children, especially with varying kinds of disabilities, and a lot of the parents, they always come and ask me, ki, sab normal hai na, and I always find that, it's a difficult thing to grapple with because the children are finding that very worrisome because they think that the parents think that there is something not normal. And, in Leonard Davis also, the word normal doesn't exist in any Indian language. It's ordinary exists, and normal has a very insidious colonial history. So what I want to ask you, both of you, as your long-term career as educators, could you offer any insight on how to, create space and hold space for the child in a classroom with specific know-hows? Because in your book also, Professor Hemachandran says, blindness is not just a disability, it's experiential knowledge. There are certain know-hows that come with that. So how do you, and try to make space for that child to have that kind of exploration and not feel like something's wrong, but also not give them the thing, that the label or that, you are slightly different from other people in a classroom. So could you please offer any insight on that?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think I often ask myself this because it's sort of a difficult, tricky thing, right? To work with a label. The label becomes important if you want to access certain help and support services, right? If you, for instance, in my own daughter's case, this is really interesting because she didn't officially qualify as dyslexic enough, right? So this is another issue. I don't want to sort of go into that thing. So we never got a certificate saying this was the issue, but she had an informal assessment which, so sometimes I think certifications help because, for instance, this child with dyslexia would get extra time in examinations and that may help up to a point, right? And all of that. But, so that's where I think labels help, and it helps in certain ways, to access, different kinds of support. But I think where it becomes difficult is if then everybody around you is using that label to make that person feel like they are different and not quite normal. And I think the word normal is such a horrible word, and I think we need to rethink that. Now, how do we go about doing this in a classroom environment? The only very quick and perhaps very useless kind of an answer I can give you is make sure schools are inclusive. So at least with the next generation of children, right? For instance, young people, my own children have always grown up with children with hearing impairments, children with blindness. They grew up in a small colony where we had children with different kinds of disabilities. So to them, it always seemed like they're perfectly ordinary like any one of us. They grew up playing hide and seek with them. So I think that was a great learning for them. Nobody had to sit down with a textbook or a story and say, look, this is how you look at it. And I think the child with the disability didn't feel any different growing up because they grew up with these children. I would like to think, at least. So I think that is the first step. That's really the first step. To use inclusive classrooms to not just because then the person with the disability is accommodated, but also because persons without disabilities learn to see that, okay, as he said, it is the norm. It's normative. It's perfectly fine, and it actually then gives you access to another world of different sorts of friendships and different kinds of camaraderie, and also learning to be a kind and empathetic human being and just a human being in its fullest sense of the word. That's important, I think.
Someshwar, would you like to?
What Srilata says is very true because the stories that I have gone through, it's the world of children that really provides us with solutions. If you remember your Lewis Carroll, Alice does not want to grow up. Why doesn't she want to grow up? Because perhaps it will take her into a world which is full of labels, right? That would differentiate. In the first story in my collection, there is this Vishakha who has a daughter who is mentally challenged, and she goes around with her, and the entire society rebukes her, abuses her for carrying the child around. And when she comes back home, the next door neighbor's son comes up and starts playing with this mentally challenged, disabled child, right? So the solution lies in creating an ethos where such people are made visible, That is the real problem. The invisibility of disabled people in surroundings creates a number of prejudices. So yes, I would agree with Srilata 100% that the first and foremost thing that needs to be done is to encourage cross-ability interactions within the classroom at the earliest possible level of intervention so that persons with disability do not come across as oddities to non-disabled children. For example, my son has grown up with me, and for him blindness is not something very abnormal, right? I met this girl in Calcutta who said that, "Sir, I'm a non-disabled child, but I have always grown up with disabled children." So for me that is not an issue, because the level of interaction and visibility of persons with disability in my life is very high. So that is very important, to create an inclusive classroom atmosphere in which we have the right kind of demographic distributions of students. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to Srilata and Someshwar for being part of this panel, and thank you to a very attentive audience that listened with attention and care and was responsive in non-verbal ways. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much.